Honor Charlotte Appleton was born in the Sussex seaside town of Brighton in 1879, the third of four children born to the Reverend John Hoblin Appleton and his wife Georgina, who encouraged all her children to pursue the arts in one form or another. But in 1890 John Appleton died prematurely of unrecorded causes, and some months later his widow and children relocated to Fulham in London. In her teens, Honor enrolled at the National Art Training School in South Kensington, followed by more study at Frank Calderon's School of Animal Painting. But it seems that wasn't enough for her, and in 1901, at the age of 22, she continued her art education at the Royal Academy Schools, along with her older sister Alice. But in 1902, when still a student, she published her first illustrated book, The Bad Mrs. Ginger. It was a modest but cheerful small-format picture book with a collection of simply rendered and generally unremarkable heavy-line drawn images with added flat washes of colour. But it was successful enough to merit another two created in an identical style, both of which were published just a year later. Dumpy Proverbs featured a collection of character studies of young children, each of which visually translated well-known proverbs with some light humorous touches. And Towlocks and His Wooden Horse was a collaboration with her sister Alice, who wrote the sparse text to accompany the images. None of these books even hinted at what she was really capable of, which didn't reveal itself until 1911's illustrated edition of William Blake's Songs of Innocence, a collection of wistful verse originally written in the late 18th century. This book revealed Appleton's uncanny and expressive ability with the combination of fine line work enhanced with subtle tonal washes of watercolour to create plausibly representational scenes of generally idyllic romanticised childhood as invoked by Blake's poems. The manifest visual qualities evident in her illustrations and the favourable critical responses they received were responsible for bringing Appleton to a far wider audience. It was at this time that she returned to Sussex with her mother and older sister Rachel and settled in Brighton's close neighbour Hove, where she would stay for the rest of her life. And from there she would somewhat reluctantly travel regularly to London, some 70 miles away, when she needed to conduct business with her publishers. A year later, in 1912, she enjoyed even greater success with yet more absorbing full-colour illustrations for her edition of the fairy tales of Charles Perrault, many of which had also been modified and published by later writers of fairy tales such as the brothers Grimm and Hans Andersen. As with the older giants of children's book illustration of the period, including Dulac and Rackham, Appleton's sophisticated images were completely reliant on the increasingly widespread use of full-colour offset lithographic printing, in combination with the best paper stock available at the time. This and more resilient binding made these publications, commonly known as gift books, quite expensive and beyond the reach of the working classes, who were more likely to be buying budget publications such as the Dumpy Proverbs. What made her work particularly distinctive was the delicacy of her fine line work, frequently rendered in a pale grey or sepia, and the tonally applied washes she then added. And although nothing is written on the subject, it's fairly obvious that her images were the result of observation of the figures and the scenic environments they were placed in. Our nursery rhyme book was published in the following year, and although I could only find a relatively small number of decent resolution images to show here, what I did find was possessed of similar absorbing aesthetically considered qualities, with this image for the cover and frontispiece being a particularly evocative example. In 1914, Appleton was commissioned to create illustrations for an edition of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and although not without its more sentimental moments, the narrative was frequently far darker than anything she had illustrated previously. Nevertheless, she rose to the challenge with a collection of haunting images which depicted Scrooge's series of ghostly encounters and ultimate redemption with great narrative success. It was also in 1914 that she illustrated the book How I Tamed the Wild Squirrels, written by Eleanor Tyrrell. And the nature of this narrative gave Appleton the perfect opportunity to showcase her flawless watercolour wash technique and her equal facility for the expressive visual capture of endearing animals, which she accomplished with a complete absence of anthropomorphic techniques. During the First World War she became a nurse for the Civil Defence, but in 1916 she had another 2 books published. More About the Squirrels was a sequel to the earlier Eleanor Tyrrell book, and naturally enough the success of the first one, much of which had undoubtedly been due to Appleton's engaging illustrations, led to her being commissioned to produce yet more for this follow-up. And they were another set of remarkably well observed and rendered images which were humorous and sentimental by turns. The second book of 1916 was Josephine and Her Dolls, written by Mrs. H.C. Craddock, the nom de plume of Augusta Whiteford. It was a mix of full-colour and line-only images about a young girl and her collection of dolls and toys which come to life, or are at least imagined to do so. And although the images she created for this book showed that she was equally adept with expressive line-only illustration, it was undoubtedly the colour pages that were the dominant reason for the book's success. Despite the charming premise, this narrative actually alluded, if only innocently, to the concept of war, with the dolls in opposing armies and even a make-believe field hospital. I could find no record of whether Appleton ever married or had children, but if not, she must have had access to at least one young model in order to make such plausible anatomical drawings. The first book was an unprecedented success and led to the publication of several more along similar lines in the years that followed. They were a collection of inconsequential but charming narratives of an entirely domestic nature, which the young female readers could identify with, but with the fanciful bonus of humorous animated behaviour by the dolls. And it was this gentle but slapstick behaviour, as outlined in each story, which produced the most engrossing and entertaining images from Appleton, all of which would hold the reader's interest for quite some time. Not only did these books sell in large numbers, but they were reprinted and repackaged for several decades to come, and the series also spawned merchandise in the form of this toy box full of replicas of Josephine's little friends. This series kept her more than busy enough for the next few years, but in 1920 her illustrated edition of the fairy tales of Hans Andersen was published. And just like the earlier Perrault fairy tales, Appleton was the perfect choice to bring these generally romantic fantasy stories to visual life. The book featured some full-page monochromes, which were another clear demonstration of her prowess and sensitive application of pen and ink, easily the equal of many of her contemporaries. But despite the pleasure to be had from these line drawings, it was of course her colour pages which stole the show. Many others, including those at the top of the profession, had also created versions of these stories, and many more would do so later. But Appleton's lightness of touch, delicate application of colour washes, and keenly observed anatomy combined to make this a particularly wistful and emotionally charged collection of fantasy images, most of which favoured single characters set against airy scenic backgrounds. And Andersen's stories generally favoured young female protagonists, which obviously played to her strengths and general disposition. In 1922 she illustrated another Craddock book, Peggy and Joan, and although it wasn't part of the Josephine series, the story followed remarkably similar lines, with 2 young sisters whose uncle was a toy maker whose creations come to life. But however thematically repetitive the subject matter might have been, as always Appleton's colour-washed illustrations were possessed of abundant visual appeal. The now ambivalently titled Me and My Pussies followed in 1924, and this was a return to a solo project for Appleton, who had not illustrated her own writing for over 2 decades. Unsurprisingly, the young readers were again presented with a central girl character, who in this instance interacts with a collection of generally miscreant cats in a series of small adventures and misadventures. And as with the Josephine books, the tales confine themselves to an entirely believable domestic world, which in this instance was totally devoid of any fantasy elements, but which was nevertheless totally engaging and lightly amusing for the young reader. As far as I can tell, Josephine's Birthday, the last in the series, was published in 1925, although so many were reprinted I couldn't say for sure. Naturally enough, it stuck to the same tried and tested formula all the others had conformed to. But even if it was just more of the same, the images were every bit as charming in their evocation of the little domestic scenes as all the others had been. And just like the rest of the series, its popularity was enduring, and it was still being published several decades later. With no more text coming her way from Mrs. Craddock, Appleton's output became noticeably more sporadic from this point onwards. But in 1926 the Book of English Verse was published, and she created more of her expected fine watercolours to accompany each of the poems, all aimed at young readers, with both fantasy and more prosaic everyday themes of considerable variety and pictorial attraction. In 1929 the Book of Animal Tales by Stephen Southwold was published, which consisted of rewritten versions of older stories gathered from a wide range of sources, all of which featured creatures both mythical and real prominently within the narrative. A similarly generic publication, The Golden Road in English Literature by Amy Cruz, followed in 1931. Like the earlier Book of Animal Tales, this was a selection of retold highlights from well-known works of fiction, some of which had always been aimed at young readers, but there were also others, including sequences from Gulliver's Travels and the Canterbury Tales, which had never been intended for children, but were now appearing in sanitised versions. By this time the rewriting of earlier fiction had become regrettably quite commonplace in children's publishing, but from Appleton's perspective they still provided her with the opportunity to create more of her entirely inoffensive pictures to capture the imagination of the child readers. Another extended sabbatical took place following this book, and it was 1938 before the Children's Book of Favourite Tales was published, another collection of rewrites which would unfortunately be typical of Appleton's later commissions. Among others in this series there were pointless retellings of Alice in Wonderland and Black Beauty, all of which featured a solitary colour frontispiece image by Appleton, but all others created and published as small spot monochromes. Nevertheless, Appleton's illustrations did to some extent make up for the shortcomings of the writing, and although I completely failed to see why it was considered a good idea to mutilate Joel Chandler Harris's original text for the Brer Rabbit stories, her visual contribution was never less than engaging and suitably humorous and energetic. The last in this collection was 1941's A Children's Book of Dogs, which followed the identical pattern, with an agreeable colour frontispiece and monochrome spots. And although nothing to do with this series, Sarah Combe Bryant's Epaminondas and Other Stories, mercifully presented as originally written, was another largely black and white offering. These seem to have been her last published illustrations, and Honor Appleton died on New Year's Eve 1951 at the age of 72. During her career she illustrated over 150 books, although I could only find visual evidence of considerably fewer than that. And it's somewhat depressing that, like others I've featured in the series, that so little is recorded about her life, and that she is now pretty much unknown to anyone who doesn't have a fairly obsessive interest in the subject of illustration. It's also a pity her career reached its apex quite a few years before she actually stopped working, and the later commissions were not of the same potential or quality as when she was at her most popular. But in my research for this video I was pleasantly surprised to discover that in 1992 the author Pamela Prince put together a news story titled A Day with Josephine and Her Friends, and repurposed many of Appleton's illustrations for an entirely new generation of children. I have no idea how well this book sold, but I like to think it found favour with the little readers. And in addition to these entertaining bonus Josephine images, here are a few more from other commissions I couldn't make room for earlier, or simply couldn't find out what they had been created for.